Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book versus episode video. In today's video, we're going to be looking at Say Cheese and Die Again, the book versus the episode. Now, I have here the Say Cheese and Die DVD, which if you turn over it on the back, you will see Say Cheese and Die Again, so I'll be using this as a point of reference. Now, if you didn't watch my review of both of these, I gave the book a 2.75 out of 5 stars, which is a D minus. It's a bad book. I think it's not quite a terrible follow-up, but it's a very poor follow-up to an iconic, first 10 original 62 book that a lot of people seem to forget nowadays because it's been out of print, and if it is talked about, it's talked about for its controversy. Now, the episode, I gave a 1.5 out of 5 stars, and I said this was pretty much terrible. And I explained in my review that this episode, I think, was pretty much the catalyst for the showrunners to know that the writing was on the wall with this project, because at some point they're going to be retreading and doing things that they don't want to do and being forced to make. And this was one of the hard confirmed episodes from many production company members that were involved in making this show. And they vouched for this, that this was one of the few that they were essentially forced to make, even though they didn't want to do it. So perhaps that lends to the quality of it, but who knows? So yeah, this is not going to be a fun book versus episode for me. Say Cheese and Die was one of the first Goosebumps books I ever read when I was a young kid. It was within the first 5 books. I know that for a fact. And I remember Say Cheese and Die Again was a book that I was jonesing to get to as a young kid. And I remember reading it and thinking that it was not as good. But over time, I grew to see how much of a bad egg it really is in Goosebumps. And I'm not here to, preach to you all about right and wrong, but this story both ways you go here, to me, is just kind of wrong in some aspects and just hard to stomach and hard to read and watch at points, just because of how mean-spirited it can be. But with that aside, a little rant aside, in these book versus episode videos, I always look at some criteria that both inherently have, and I decide which one I think is better. In my previous book versus episode video for Say Cheese and Die, I went over the main criteria that we always go over, like characters. I run down all the characters that are in either version. Sometimes they're in one and not the other, and it's mutually exclusive. Sometimes it's not with that. So I like to run down those and decide which one did it better with them. I look at the atmosphere and decide which one had a better atmosphere. I look at the overall plot and dissect the plot and go over which one I think was done better. I look at the climax, which one had a better climax, and then the ending. And for specific book versus episodes, sometimes I bring up tone and sometimes I bring up aesthetics, but the latter more than the former. For this one, we will bring up aesthetics, because since I brought up the aesthetic of how the camera looks and what it's declared to necessarily do in the first episode, I'm going to re-bring it up here and go over that aesthetic as well, and talk about which one I think did it better there too. So yeah, we have a lot to talk about with Say Cheese and Die Again, and we have a lot of characters to mull over, and some go to one particular installment by default majority of the time, so we might as well start them off here. So we have the main character, which is a good jumping off point, Greg Banks. Now this is the second and last appearance of Greg Banks in the Goosebumps universe. He was the main star in the episode and in the book of the original Say Cheese and Die. He was played by Ryan Gosling. But in Say Cheese and Die Again, they recasted his character. And while, in the episode, I don't think Greg Banks is a terrible character. I just feel like he's so wooden, and his actor, given the material, it does not fare well for his character. And I think a lot of points of the story that can be considered dumb are highlighted worse here in the episode compared to the book, because the book has the monologue and the introspective of Greg a little more. And to be honest, I don't think either one serves his character's legacy of any good. But I do think that in the book, Greg's a little more open and honest. He's all he's closer to his friends, so he has this urge to not be in this journey of like by himself. And I don't know, like things that he goes through in the story are harrowing, but also due to his own chagrin. Either way you go, he makes a decision in the very beginning of the story where he's given an assignment to essentially talk about a true event that happened, and he decides to share all of the events of the first story as the assignment. And of course, nobody believes him. So, yeah, it's understandable if you don't like his character in this book and think that he's developed sequelitis, because a lot of ways he has. But if I had a preference for Greg, if I had to choose, I'm going to give the book the edge here. I just think he's written a little bit better, and I don't know, he's a little more down to earth and still kind of the likable Greg that we got in the first book, but even then, he was more average in that first book, so take that for what you will. Now we're going to move on to side characters, and I guess the first one we can bring up, which is a fun one, is Mr. Sour. In both versions, Mr. Sour is part of the reason why Greg goes on this reluctant journey to go back to the old abandoned house in the book, and I guess the old building in the episode, to retrieve this camera from this demolished location. And Mr. Sour, he's very mean in both versions. In the book, he goes above and beyond to humiliate Greg at various points of the story. And there's a part where, I didn't go over this with Greg's character, but what he goes through in the story, either way you go, is that the camera that's cursed and has taken a picture of him turns him to be obese. And Mr. Sour is absolutely awful in the book. But in the episode, he's weirdly funny in like an indirect way, which I think kind of helps the situation. And I think what they do with his character in the episode is more entertaining. And I don't know if it's part of the actor's charm kind of helping that. But in my opinion, I just feel like Mr. Sour is a little bit dialed back in the episode. And given the material we got with the ending, I think his character sticks out more to me in the episode. So I'm going to give Mr. Sour to the episode. Now we have the main friend that's in both versions, and I guess we can go ahead and run over her real quick. Not actually run her over, but talk about her. And that is Sherry. Sherry is Greg's best friend in both versions, and she ends up getting involved with the story in some capacity when Greg ends up getting the camera from said location that he needs to get it from, and he accidentally takes a picture of her, which causes her to, instead of get obese like him, she loses weight at a rapid rate. In the episode, she looks more sickly and actually is described and shown to be like shrinking down to bone, as you can see on the back cover here. That's supposed to be her hand. As in the book, her material is her clothes just fall off of her, and there's an awkward scene where her skirt falls down in front of everyone. Yeah. But, she's kind of even here. Sherry doesn't really have much of an emphasis. But I will say the moments we got with her, when we did get her in the story, I think she was a bit of a voice of reason in the book. And she was urging Greg not to go get the camera. As in the episode, she had no idea of Greg's plan because Greg was in it on his own from the get-go, unlike the book. So I don't know. She has more redeeming moments in the book, but she has more scary moments in the episode. So for that, I think they kind of balance out. So I'm going to tie Sherry here. Another character we can go over that's in both versions here is Terry, which is Greg's older brother. His main purpose of the story is that he's a 16-year-old high schooler, and he has a job at a camera shop where he develops photos. And he's integral to the climax of the story, where both Sherry and Greg need him to develop the photos that they took into a negative and a positive to reverse the effects of the camera on their bodies, essentially. It's essentially the same. He gets pretty much the same amount of screen time. He's pretty much built like the same character. I have no real discernible difference. So for Terry, I'm going to tie Terry here. Now we got a long list of characters that are pretty much book exclusive. So we'll go ahead and run those over real quick. We have Bird and Michael. I'm just going to kind of put them in a loop here. They're Greg's best guy friends. They're only in the book, so I'm going to give the edge to both of them here. by default. But Bert and Michael, along with Sherry, is trying to be a voice of reason early on for Greg. But then later on, they become really big jerks to Greg when he's gaining weight, and kind of laugh along the peanut gallery when they're playing at a park with Greg. There's this whole scene where they're trying to like hang out and, you know, just throw a ball around, I guess, or play baseball, and they act like complete jerks. So, yeah, take that for what you will. I guess the episode didn't have the budget for him, but yeah, take that for what you will. And I guess we can go over another character that's brand new to the story, which is John. And I guess his dad, but mainly just John. John in the book is exclusive to the story, so by default he goes here. But he's the kid that has the property that Spidey's former dwelling used to stand on. And he knows about the camera and tells Greg, and then he has the whole accident with his picture getting taken and his foot getting impaled by a long nail. And that's pretty much the only scene he's in the story. But it is the catalyst to kick off the camera shenanigans in the book. So for that, it's memorable and easily one of the most memorable parts of the whole book. So yeah, John, I wish he was in the episode, but I kind of get why he's not there. And I guess one last character to go down before we move on is Spidey. Yes, Spidey's technically not in the book or the episode, but he's more hinted to be in the episode, perhaps in a dream vision, or possibly following Greg around in his hysteria about having the camera, or maybe the anxiety linked to that. So I guess we can include him as an episode exclusive, so he goes here. He's involved in a dream sequence fake out in the very beginning of the episode that's quite tense, and there's a scene where his shadow is implied to be possibly lurking behind Greg. I don't know if that was supposed to be a tease for that, or maybe a lead up to him running into Sherry. I couldn't tell you, but Spidey's heavily applied to still be around in the story, even though I guess in the first Say Cheese and Die book, he's more explicitly declared pretty much dead. As in the episode, it's very ambiguous where, you know, you leave off on the two bullies from the first episode, and he's kind of just in the room being released from the camera, and we never find out what's happened to him. So I kind of like that they teased the continuity there a little bit with his character. So yeah, it wasn't a complete wash there with that, I guess. So yeah, that's basically all I have to say for characters. I guess we can go over the two bullies that are in the story of the book too, I guess. We'll run them over real quick. Sumo 1 and Sumo 2, as I call them, as the book calls them. They're the big guy jerks in the story. Yeah, I mean, they just go to the book because they're only in there. Now, in terms of atmosphere, let's go ahead and run over the atmosphere. You know, it's later in the school year, and that's basically all this book has going for it. In the episode, it looks like a generic time of year. I mean, there's no real Prowse writing in the book to really declare what it's trying to be set in. And like I said, it in a lot of ways just feels like R.L. Stine rushed through this book. The episode's same way. I mean, the creators didn't really care to set the mood up or anything like that. But, you know, if I had to pick, I'd probably tie them reluctantly. You know, now thinking on it, I guess we can go ahead and move into aesthetics and tone. Tone. You know, might as well bring this up because while they have very similar tones, and it might be asinine to even compare this, I do think that there is one more approach that the episode adds to it that kind of makes it a little fun comparison here, where you have this psychosis implication, and then you have certain things that they do differently in terms of the aesthetics kind of bleed into that. So this is kind of a twofer here. Going into the aesthetics, of course, we have the camera, right? The camera, I think, is still cooler in the episode than it is in the book, even though the book, like its former counterpart, is described to be an old vintage camera that can do, you know, disposable pictures. I think the cool futuristic look of the camera that we get in the episode, as you can see up here, I think that's just a more iconic design to me. So for that, I like the episode more, and I think it's still more concrete, even in this episode, of what it actually does than the book. The book, it's like, oh, it takes a, you know, it does things bad to you, it predicts bad outcomes or whatnot, but I think it's more of a Say Cheese and Die Again thing saying that in the book than the first one did. The episode, it's clear that this is still an ongoing thing, so I'm gonna give it to that for that. But going back to maybe like the basement dwelling scene is a bit different, and the aesthetics of actually having Spidey's lair still intact in the episode, I think was a really cool, different change up to the source material. So if we want to go off that, maybe that can win out here as well in the episode. But overall, for aesthetics and tone, I weirdly think that the episode has a better approach. So take that for what you will. Now, moving to overall plot, both are very much the same story, but kind of tweaked. The book, Greg, he has an assignment, right? He needs to pass this assignment in his English class and have Mr. Sauer give him a good grade so he can go on a summer vacation of a lifetime, staying with his cousins all summer, and he can get out of the town that they live in, right? But he has to go back and get this camera since he decided to share the camera story and got ostracized by his peers and his classmates. And when everybody finds out that he's, going to do this, they try to tell him not to, but he feels like he's being forced to do this to, get a good grade. So he goes and gets the camera, but there's a whole different way of how he gets it. In the book, he goes to the property, and the little boy, John, told him that the demolition crew already came in and destroyed the basement area, but they threw a bunch of stuff into the garbage. And when Greg mentions the camera, he goes and gets the camera from the garbage, and that catches the attention of John. And that's, them going back and forth whether they should tell John's dad or not about the camera was the catalyst of Greg taking the photo of him and causing the nail accident. Well, when John gets carted off, the rest of the story continues where Greg, he tries to show his teacher the next day, but a substitute's there instead. So he's holding the camera and he's interacting with his friend Sherry, and there's some accidental photos taken, and then chaos ensues from there where he starts gaining weight and his friend Sherry starts losing weight. He gets ostracized by his peers, and it gets down to a point where they're so far down this body transformation that they need to get it reversed so they can live another day. So that's when Greg's brother comes into the situation with their new idea. Instead of ripping up the photos, they have to, in this version, or I guess in this sequel, I should say, make positive and negatives of the photos. Yeah, whatever. So that's pretty much the plot of the book, and the episode pretty much faithfully does that, but it trims out quite a bit of characters. It trims out a good amount of the context of Greg being extra humiliated by Mr. Sauer. And, the dream fake out sequence is a big noticeable difference. I mean, you don't have the nail scene, but you do have the added basement scene with this new guy. I don't know why I didn't bring him up. He's hardly in the episode, but instead of having John, you have this real estate tycoon guy with a ponytail that's down in the basement with him. I guess we can go back to characters real quick. He goes to the episode because he's only in there. But, instead, Greg takes a picture of him instead of the little boy John, right? And what ends up happening is, from there, Greg, like usual, meets with Sherry, like the book counterpart, and, the same stuff unfolds, essentially, until you get down to the different ending, or, it's pretty much a different ending. In terms of plot, I can appreciate the episode for being more streamlined, but in my opinion, I just think the book did it better. There's more to chew on with Greg's monologue. There's more events to make him sympathetic. Especially, I skimmed over the surface about the weight gaining stuff and the stuff that Greg goes through. That's severely trimmed down in the episode as well. And while that's the most controversial stuff, and it's hard to read in the book, I feel like the emotions we get from Greg is kind of the saving grace to that at the same time. So take that for what you will. But if I had to pick overall plot, I'm going to give it to the book. Now, in terms of, I guess we can go down to the climax. The book and the episode had the same exact climax. The characters arrived to the conclusion that they shouldn't rip up the photos. Well, I guess the episode doesn't even touch on that because it's not even a thing. But in the book, they realized that ripping up the photos might be a detriment to their situation and they can possibly come out worse, even though that's the solution they came to in the first book. I don't get why they didn't rip them up, but it's there, I guess. And it doesn't really matter on that aspect as much, because the end result is they end up going to the camera store that Greg's brother works at, right? And from there, they wait while Greg's brother is making positive and negative photos to kind of help the situation due to their, requests without actually knowing what's actually going on. And I also realized I've skimmed the surface on additional stuff that they've gone through at this point. Like, there's some extra stuff in the book where Greg gets his photo taken a second time, right? And, his skin is flaking off, and that perhaps is going on in the climax as they're waiting for the aftermath of the photo to take place. Well, in the climax of the episode, there really is no wait, because there's more of an instantaneous relief, let's just say. But they both still operate in the same fashion. But I think in terms of the ambiguity of the climax and kind of leaving you wanting to figure out more, the book does it better. So for that, I think the book wins on the climax. Now for the ending, I think in terms of endings, the book's ending's very weak. It's very weak. Greg decides in the final chapter or two that, given the whole ordeal, the story that he's gone through and all the ostracization, he wants to get revenge on Mr. Sauer for humiliating him in front of his peers, which is understandable, but the way the story ends is not as iconic as the episode is. In the episode, the revenge aspect isn't really full-blown. You don't really understand why Greg brought the camera again back to class. I guess he wanted to give one last crack at it to see if Mr. Sauer would finally cave. And through that, an accident happens, and we get the ending with Mr. Sauer that, in my opinion, is way better and more satisfying. So for that, I'm going to give the ending to the episode, shockingly. So where does that leave me with Say Cheese and Die Again? Well, if you can tell points-wise, you might think this is a runaway, but I actually feel that this is a pretty close call. Because even though the episode is the absolute pits and is terrible, and the book is bad, they have comparable qualities to them. And I'll go over them. I think where the book excels is having a better Greg. I think the plot is better. I think the climax is a bit better in the book as well. It's a little more ambiguous. I think maybe in terms of atmosphere, it could have some, aspects to the writing and just the charm of the town Pitt's Landing or whatever it's called. Through the writing that makes it a little more charming. And some side characters and events that we just don't get in the episode that I think are really iconic in their own right. So the book has that. But then the episode, you have a better Mr. Sauer. You have arguably equal atmosphere. It's very average, but, there's some commendable things there. You have some better aesthetics and maybe some better tone in terms of, them trying to be more tense and scary with it at times. The ending is better. So it's a fair fight. It's a fair fight with these two for me. But if I had to pick which one I think is superior, at the end of the day, I think because of Greg, ironically, I know how much people dislike Greg in this book. I think he's a little bit better in the book. So that to me is going to be the deciding factor. And if I had to pick, it's going to be by a sliver of like a millimeter of a hair. I'm going to give it to the book, and I think the book is superior. Now, if you would ask me on a different day, I might actually tie these, even though there's a significant points difference. But to me, I don't do exact points for F tiers. Like I do 0.5 increments, like a 1, 1.5, and a 2. Anything above that, like a 2.5 onward, I'll do exact points, right? A 2.7 compared to a 1.5 might sound like a lot, but it really isn't. Because, like I said, there's not a lot separating that for me. But I think they're both kind of comparable. They both have their edges over the other. But I think just the presentation and the package, I think, is just a bit better in the book overall than it is in the episode. But the episode still is a short and sweet version of it. It is a condensed version if you're into that stuff. So I can see if you might swing this way. But it's not for me. But always remember, Goosebumps is a book franchise, first and foremost. Go read the book and then go watch the episode. In the case of Say Cheese and Die Again, I see a lot of you probably will have a hard time finding enjoyment in either one of these. But if you're looking at them in a comparison type of way, I think that through that you might be able to find some charming things in both versions if you're willing to lend yourself to it. And I know how much the story overall is hated and what have you, and it is what it is. But yeah, go read the book and then watch the episode. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this comparison here. Let me know down in the comment section about Say Cheese and Die. Which one do you think is better? Do you think the book is better? Do you think the episode is better? Or do you think they're maybe tied? Who knows? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.